Imagine that one morning you wake up sick to your stomach and rush to the bathroom to vomit up the contents of your stomach. You must be sick. Maybe it's just a stomach bug. Nothing to worry about. Everything seems normal, so you go about your life, but it keeps happening. You can't figure out what's going on. Weeks pass and you finally realize the cause with nervous clarity. A trip to the pharmacy bathroom later, you have your answer. 2 little pink lines. You know what that means. You've seen it in movies and TV. How did this happen? The problem with this story isn't simply a teenager making a dumb mistake. You can't protect yourself if you don't fully understand your options and the consequences that accompany them. The problem with this story is the lack of knowledge and understanding. The only solution is education, which the United States is horribly insufficient and inconsistent with. The United States has one of the highest teen pregnancy rates in the developed world. By their senior year of high school, more than 3 out of 10 girls have been pregnant at least once. If something as complicated as teen pregnancy needs to be solved, then we need to work from the ground up. This begins with education. In this video, we will look at the current status of sex ed in America. To understand how we arrived here, we will briefly examine the history of American sex education, before analyzing the 2 major approaches to it used nationwide. Finally, we will discuss how we can move forward to improve sex ed in America. In 1892, the National Education Association addressed the topic of sex education for the first time, passing a regulation that called for moral education in the schools. But it wasn't until the rampant spread of STDs during World War II that the federal government truly became involved in sex education through programming on social hygiene for soldiers and eventually school-aged children. After the sexual revolution of the 1960s, religious conservative groups pushed for abstinence-only education in schools. The AIDS epidemic in the 80s led to a push for comprehensive sex education. But in the late 1990s, pressure from conservative groups led the government to adopting abstinence-only education as its main approach to adolescent sexual and reproductive health. Abstinence-only education stresses abstaining from or avoiding sex until marriage as the most effective way to prevent unplanned pregnancy and STIs. Typically, it excludes instruction on contraceptive methods like hormonal birth control and condoms. This method is supported by conservative organizations like the Family Research Council and was adamantly championed by the Bush administration, which allocated $206 million in federal funding to abstinence-only education programs in the early 2000s. The second of the main approaches to sex education is comprehensive sexual education, which includes instruction on contraception, sexual health, healthy relationships, and safe sex. It provides a holistic curriculum that focuses on teaching skills for safer sex rather than taking a particular stance on sexual behavior. It was the choice of the Obama administration, with $200 million going to these programs each year. So now we are going to analyze abstinence-only education and comprehensive sex education. While at first glance, abstinence-only education may seem like an attractive curriculum, its critics propose some major problems. First, while teaching students to avoid risky sexual behavior may sound like a good idea, it ignores something fundamental about Americans. They have sex. According to a study by the National Survey of Family Growth, 95% of respondents reported having sex before marriage. Abstinence-only education outright ignores the fact that most Americans have premarital sex. This method then has the potential to leave people ill-equipped to handle the risk and reality of sex. A second major problem with abstinence-only education is that it ignores what many parents want their kids to learn. In a survey by NPR, 70% of parents surveyed supported teaching broader sex ed, including contraception, and 77% of parents believe that giving teens more info on sex would lead to safer sex in the future. It is clear that parents want a more broad approach to sex education for their children. The final and most important problem with abstinence-only sex education is glaring. Many studies have linked abstinence-only sex ed to increased rates of teen pregnancy and higher STI infection. Let's take Texas, for example. Texas has the fourth highest teen pregnancy rate in the U.S., a full 1/3 higher than the national average. 60% of schools teach abstinence-only education, but a quarter of Texan teenagers receive no form of sex ed whatsoever. This blatant lack of even basic sex ed in some areas may contribute to Texas's massive problem with teen pregnancy. Abstinence-only education clearly comes with many inherent problems that need to be considered before teaching it to impressionable young minds, but it is not the only option. This leaves us with comprehensive sex education, a much more realistic and applicable option compared to abstinence-only sex education. For comprehensive sex ed, teaching life skills is more important than arguing the morality of sex. It comes with many benefits for America. By the National Center for Biotechnical Information, it leads to lower teen pregnancy rates, reduced STI diagnoses, and actually to decreased likelihood of teens engaging in sexual activity. A recent example of this in action would be the implementation of sweeping comprehensive sex education in D.C. public schools. They began teaching basic forms of sex ed as young as 3rd grade and moving on to more adult topics as students age. The lessons build on each other each year. This allows students to develop life skills that they need to protect themselves. After the start of this program, the D.C. Department of Health reported that between 2011 and 2015, their teen pregnancy rates dropped by 42%. Other states with similar comprehensive sex education programs have had similar results, though not as drastic. States like California, New Jersey, and Oregon have sex ed programs that require medically accurate information and coverage of broad topics like gender, sexuality, relationships, and even body image. Their teen pregnancy rates are 3%, 4%, and 11% lower, respectively, than the national average. Additionally, some experts note the issue with shame and stigma associated with abstinence-only sex education. Where comprehensive sex ed gives students a variety of options regarding sexual behavior, abstinence-only recommends the avoidance of it altogether, creating a negative stigma around teenage sexuality. In a study from the Journal of Social Problems, the researchers found that this negative stigma can reinforce negative outcomes rather than avoiding them, by making teens more anxious or afraid to seek help or resources if they need them. For example, when faced with problems such as STI infection, teens are more likely to turn to friends who are equally as uninformed as they are, instead of seeking the help of parents or professionals. Abstinence-only education may only perpetuate the problems that it tries to prevent. Comprehensive sex education may avoid these potential problems. Clearly, giving teens access to more information about sex allows them to make decisions that are better for them and their futures, and avoids reinforcing potential negative outcomes. But not all students have access to this important information. Sex education, especially in America, is a complex and important issue that needs to be handled with reason and care. Research shows that the way that sex ed is taught in many places across the country is ineffective. It puts teens at risk for unplanned pregnancy and STI infection, while ignoring both the reality for most Americans and the stance of many parents. For many experts and organizations, the answer is clear. The U.S. needs a more comprehensive and consistent approach to sex education. To decrease the risks associated with sex, students need more instruction and information on basic concepts like contraception, STIs, and HIV. But for this to happen, laws and curriculums need to change, which means people must fight for reform. This is where you come in. This can be as simple as talking to a friend or having an open discussion with your children about sex, or as big as joining an activist group. The best way for the average person to change things is to be more politically active and well-informed. No action is too small. Follow the news, call your senator or representative if you don't agree with something. But above all, vote. Voting is the most important way to change things. Nothing will change if people sit by and do nothing.